Thousands of people across 7 decades on every inhabited continent describe the same core sequence, a light that does not behave like any known aircraft, a period of missing time they cannot account for, and then fragmented memories of small, gray-skinned beings with large, unblinking eyes, moving through a space that feels both clinical and profoundly alien. Most popular accounts fixate on the physical details, the shape of the craft, the medical procedures, the samples taken. And those details are consistent, too. Consistent enough that folklorists and psychologists have spent decades debating whether they are a product of shared culture, shared neurology, or something far stranger. But if you read the full testimony, not the edited clips used for documentaries, not the chapters selected for bestsellers, there is a thread that runs through almost every credible account that almost no one talks about. It is not a procedure. It is a question. Always the same core question. Phrased 100 different ways, translated from a form of communication that does not use words, asked of people who have never met each other, who lived in different countries, different decades, who had no way of knowing anyone else had ever been asked the same thing. And it is the most unsettling part of the entire phenomenon, because it reveals a limit to their capabilities that no one expected. I want to open with a woman almost no one has heard of. Her name is Ellen Carter. She was a 38-year-old secretary and mother of 2 living in rural Ohio in the summer of 1976. On the night of July 12th, she was driving home alone from a sister's birthday party, 20 miles outside of Columbus, when she saw a silver disc-shaped object hover 50 feet above the road ahead of her. Her car engine died. Her radio went to static. The next thing she remembered, she was sitting in her driveway. The car clock showing 2 hours had passed. Her dress was inside out, and she had a small, unexplained burn on the back of her left hand. She told no one for almost 4 years, afraid of being labeled crazy until she heard a local radio interview with Dr. James Harlow, a psychologist and UFO researcher who specialized in regressive hypnosis for people with missing time. Under hypnosis, recorded over 3 sessions in 1980, Ellen described being floated out of her car through a beam of light into a large curved room with no visible corners, lit by a soft, diffuse white light that cast no shadows. She described 3 beings standing around a raised, hard table, short gray, with large almond-shaped black eyes, thin limbs, no visible ears or hair. They placed her on the table. She described the standard examination, small, sharp instruments, a light that seemed to see inside her, the feeling of being scanned down to her bones. She was terrified, she said, but she could not move, could not scream. And then, halfway through the procedure, everything stopped. One of the beings moved to the head of the table, leaned over her, and looked directly into her eyes. It did not speak, but she received a clear, unmistakable impression. A concept dropped directly into her mind with no language attached, that she later translated into these words: "What do you carry inside you? Not what is your name. Not what planet do you live on. Not how does your propulsion system work. Not how many weapons do you have. What do you carry inside you?" She was confused. She thought at first it meant her organs, her physical body. But the impression intensified. No, not that. The thing inside that makes you afraid right now. The thing that makes you love your children. The thing that hurts when someone you care about leaves. That. What is that? I wrote that line down in my notebook when I first accessed Harlow's private archive, donated to a small university after his death in 2014. I marked it with a star, thought it was a strange, isolated detail from a single witness. I should not have, because over the next 3 years, as I worked my way through 200+ unpublished case files from research collections across 3 countries, files that never made it to television, never made it to books, were only ever shared between a small network of investigators who took this work seriously, I found that exact question, or something so close to it the difference did not matter, again and again and again. It was there in a 1962 account from a sheep farmer outside of Buenos Aires, Argentina, who told a local ufologist that after a 90-minute encounter, a being had paused and asked him, in a series of wordless images, "Why does loss hurt you so much?" It was there in a 1994 MUFON report from a logger in northern British Columbia, Canada, who described the being stopping mid-examination to ask, "What is the weight of a memory?" It was there in a 1982 case from a small village outside of Osaka, Japan, investigated by a local university parapsychology team, where a 22-year-old woman said the beings had spent 10 minutes communicating with her not about her body, but about the sadness she had carried since her father died 2 years prior. They did not judge it. They did not comfort her. They just asked over and over for her to describe what it felt like from the inside. These are not the questions of a species that has fully mapped us. These are the questions of a species that has mapped every physical part of us, every biological function, every neurological signal, and then hit a wall. A wall they cannot cross with technology, no matter how advanced. And that wall is what I want to talk about. Because once you see it, every abduction account you have ever read changes shape entirely. Let me pause here to acknowledge the obvious. The mainstream conversation about this phenomenon has, for 60 years, been dominated by two competing frames. The first is the biological frame. They are here to take samples, to study our DNA, to create hybrids, to harvest something from our bodies. There is no shortage of testimony to support this. Thousands of people describe invasive procedures, reproductive examinations, the removal of eggs or sperm. I am not here to dismiss any of that. It is a consistent, documented part of the pattern. The second frame is the technological frame. They are scouting our planet, assessing our military capabilities, monitoring our nuclear programs, deciding if we are a threat or a resource. This too has supporting evidence, from the hundreds of military sightings over nuclear silos to the repeated encounters near defense installations. But both of these frames miss half the story. Because if you read the full transcripts, not just the edited highlights, the biological procedures almost always end. The scan stops. The instruments are set aside. And then the questions start. Not about the body, about what is inside the body. That is not the body. One of the most respected researchers in this field, a woman named Dr. Eleanor Voss, who spent 30 years working with abductees in the Pacific Northwest, wrote in an unpublished 1991 conference paper that she had seen this pattern in 72 of the 117 subjects she had worked with. She called it the effective pivot. They finish the physical work, and then they shift, she wrote. It is like a scientist who has finished dissecting a specimen, and then suddenly realizes there is something inside the specimen that cannot be dissected. Something that vanishes the moment you cut the body open. And so they stop cutting, and they start asking. And the shift in their demeanor is palpable. From detached clinical efficiency to something that can only be described as intense, almost urgent focus. They need the answer to this question more than they needed any of the biological data. Urgent. That word stopped me when I read it. Why urgent? If you are a civilization that can cross the galaxy, or bend space, or move through walls, or do any of the things these accounts describe you doing, why would the interior emotional life of a random human being feel like an urgent problem to solve? What could you possibly not have figured out with all that technology that would make this question matter enough to ask it of thousands of people over 70 years all over the world? Let me ground this in another case, one that is partially known in ufology circles, but almost always discussed for the wrong reasons. In 1962, a 28-year-old Australian sugarcane farmer named Ron Callahan reported a 4-hour encounter on his property outside of Mackay, Queensland. The case is usually cited for its more sensational details. The 3 humanoid figures, the craft landing in his cane field, the physical marks left on his body, the fact that 3 neighbors also reported seeing a strange light in the sky that same night. What is almost never mentioned is the final 10 minutes of his account, the part he told only to the primary investigator, and refused to repeat for newspaper reporters because he thought it made him sound weak. After all the procedures were done, after they had taken blood and skin samples, after they had scanned every inch of him, he said, they helped him sit up on the edge of the table. He was crying, he said, half from fear, half from relief that it seemed to be over. One of the beings stood in front of him, and again, no words, just a direct impression. Does this feeling have a name? This sharp thing in your chest? The wetness on your face? Does it have a name? And what is it made of? Callahan was a tough, no-nonsense man, a former boxer who rarely cried in his adult life. He told the investigator he had no idea how to answer. He said, I told him. It was fear. But they didn't seem to get it. Like I told them the color of something they'd never seen. They just stood there, looking at me, like I was holding up a rock no one had ever found before. And then I realized they could see the tears. They could measure my heart rate, my sweat, every chemical in my blood. But they had no idea what any of it felt like. They were looking at all the signs of fear, and they couldn't see the fear itself. That line hit me harder than any other testimony I have ever read, because it is exactly the problem. Move forward 21 years to a quarry in the Brecon Beacons in Wales, 1983. A 34-year-old quarry worker named Gareth Hughes had a short, violent encounter with a diamond-shaped craft that landed on the access road near his truck. He was thrown 10 feet by a blast of air, suffered cuts and bruises on his arms and legs, and reported 2 small gray figures approaching him before he blacked out. When he came to, the craft was gone. The police were called. They found deep, unexplained impressions in the gravel, 6 feet across, that could not be explained by any vehicle known to be in the area. Hughes was a stoic man, a former soldier, who hated talking about feelings. But in his official statement, and in later interviews with a Welsh UFO research group, he mentioned one small detail that no one followed up on. When he cried out in pain as he hit the ground, the 2 figures stopped. They did not move to help him. They did not move to hurt him. They just leaned in very slightly and stared at his face for 3 or 4 seconds perfectly still. It felt like they were taking a picture of the pain, he said. Not the cut on my arm, the hurt. Like it was a thing they could collect, if they looked hard enough. Collecting pain, collecting fear, collecting grief, collecting the thing inside us that no scanner can see. Let me give you one final case, to nail the pattern shut, before I explain what I think it means. In 1991, a 42-year-old nurse I will call Rebecca. Her full name is redacted in the MUFON file. At her request, reported a 3-hour encounter at her remote cabin outside of Bend, Oregon. Her case was investigated by a local researcher named Paul Hendricks, whose files were shared with me by his widow after he passed in 2020. Rebecca described the standard sequence: the light through the window, the paralysis, the floating, the table, the examination. And then, she said, it ended. They helped her sit up. One of the beings reached out and took her right hand in its own. She emphasized, repeatedly, that this was not restraint. She was free to pull away. And she knew it. It just held her hand, very gently, for almost a minute. And then it asked, again, conceptually, no words, what is happening inside you right now? She was crying. She had not even realized she was crying until it asked. She thought at first it was asking about the tears. She tried to explain that they were just salt water, a physical reaction. But the impression came back, sharper. No. The thing that is making the water. The thing that is tight in your throat. The thing that makes you want to run even though you are not running. That. What is that? She said she tried to explain fear and sadness and the strange, tangled love she felt for her son that was mixed up in all the terror. And it was like trying to explain color to someone born blind. She could give all the signs, all the examples, all the context, but the thing itself, the raw feeling, she could not hand it over. And she got the clear impression that this was not the first time they had asked this question, and not the first time they had gotten an answer that did not fully close the gap. 4 cases, 4 countries, 4 decades, 4 people who had never met, never read each other's accounts, had no connection to each other at all, and all 4 describing the exact same core interaction. We can see every physical part of you. We can measure every signal. But we cannot see the thing that is you. The thing that feels. And we need to. There is a famous problem in the philosophy of mind, first formalized by the philosopher David Chalmers in 1995, though philosophers have been writing about it for 2,000 years. It is called the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problems of consciousness are the ones neuroscience is already solving. How the brain processes light into images, how it stores memories, how it regulates breathing, how it sends signals to move your hand. We may not have all the answers yet, but we know how to look for them. The hard problem is different. It is the question of why all those physical processes are accompanied by subjective experience at all. Why there is something it is like to be you right now, reading these words. Why a wavelength of 700 nanometers hitting your retina does not just trigger a neural signal. It produces the specific, private, unshareable experience of seeing red. Why a cut on your hand does not just send a pain signal to your brain. it hurts. No physical description of the brain, no matter how detailed, no matter how complete, can ever fully explain that. You could map every neuron in a human brain, track every chemical reaction, every electrical impulse, and you would still never know what it feels like to be the person whose brain it is. That is the wall. That is the thing they cannot cross. Think about it. If you were an extraterrestrial civilization millions of years more advanced than us, you could probably learn almost everything about humanity from a distance. You could decode our DNA. You could hack our communications. You could map every city, every weapon, every ecosystem. You could put a human being on a table, scan every cell, every hormone, every electrical firing in the brain, and build a perfect physical model of how we work. But none of that would tell you what grief feels like. None of that would tell you what hope feels like. None of that would tell you the specific, private texture of the moment a person realizes they are going to die, or the moment they hold their child for the first time. You would have all the data. You would have none of the experience. And if that experience matters to you, for whatever reason, there is only one way to get it. You have to ask. You have to sit with the person who is having the experience and get them to describe it to you as best they can through the flawed medium of language or wordless concept. You have to collect thousands and thousands of these descriptions from every kind of person, in every kind of emotional state, and try to build a map of something you can never directly access yourself. That explains the urgency Voss wrote about. That explains why the question repeats across every continent, every decade. That explains why they stop the medical exams to ask it. The exams get them the body. The question gets them the thing the body holds that no machine can extract. Now let me speculate clearly and openly. This is interpretation, not proven fact, and I am labeling it as such. There are two broad possibilities for why they need this information so badly, and both are equally unsettling. The first possibility is that they have no subjective emotional experience at all, not suppressed, not different, gone. This lines up with almost every witness description of their demeanor. No anger, no joy, no empathy, no cruelty, no warmth. Just flat, neutral, methodical focus. They are like scientists studying an ant colony. They do not hate the ants. They do not love the ants. They just need data. But if a species had evolved or engineered itself to eliminate all emotion, all subjective feeling, and then encountered a species that runs almost entirely on emotion, they would face a catastrophic blind spot. They could predict our biology perfectly. They could not predict our behavior. Because human beings do not make decisions based on logic. We make them based on love, fear, pride, grief, hope, loyalty. All things that do not show up on a scan. If you wanted to interact with us, coexist with us, control us, help us, harvest from us, you would need to understand those things. And you could not, so you would have to ask, over and over and over. The second possibility is that they do have something like emotion, but it is so fundamentally different from ours that human experience is completely illegible to them. The way sound is illegible to someone born deaf. The way color is illegible to someone born blind. They have their own interior lives, their own feelings, but they share no common ground with ours. When they see a human being cry, they see all the physical signs, but they have no reference point for what it means. It is as alien to them as their technology is to us. And so they are not asking a trivial question. They are asking the hardest question there is for them. What is it like to be a thing that feels in a way you never will? Either way, the result is the same. There is an intelligence gap, a fundamental uncrossable gap between what they can observe and what they need to know. And every intelligence operation in human history, when it hits a gap like that, escalates. It sends more agents. It runs more interviews. It collects more data. It keeps going until the gap is closed, or until it decides the gap cannot be closed. That is what we are seeing, I think, in the 70 years of repeated abductions. It is not random. It is a systematic long-term intelligence collection program, targeted at the one thing about us they cannot get any other way. I want to talk briefly about a man named Arthur Kenyon, a long-term contactee who has written 3 small self-published books about his experiences, which began when he was 7 years old in 1958 and continue to this day. He is not a famous figure. He does not do speaking tours. He has never been on television. But his accounts are remarkable for their consistency, and for the detail with which he describes the being's long-term interest in what he calls the shape of the self. He says that across 60 years of encounters, the physical exams became less and less frequent, and the questions about his interior life became more and more central. He says one being asked him, in 2012, a question he has not been able to stop thinking about. Do you know that you are the only place this thing exists? He did not understand at first. Then he realized the feeling he was describing, the specific mix of joy and regret he felt about his life, did not exist anywhere else in the universe. It was not in his blood. It was not in his brain scans. It was only inside him, and if he died without describing it, it would vanish forever. The beings were not just collecting data, they were collecting things that would otherwise be lost, things that only exist for a few decades, inside a single human skull, and then are gone. Kenyon is a complicated witness. He admits his memories are often fragmented, that he has struggled with mental health issues at points in his life, that he cannot prove a single thing that happened to him. But what matters for our purposes is that his account of the core question is identical to Ellen Carter's, to Ron Callahan's, to Rebecca's, to Gareth Hughes. The details of the craft change. The details of the procedures change. The question never does. Now let us talk about the silence. The official silence. In the United States, Project Blue Book collected 12,618 UFO reports between 1952 and 1969. It classified 701 as unexplained. But it never, not once, opened a formal investigation into an abduction claim. Officially, contact with beings was outside the scope of the project. They only cared about the craft, the aerial object. In the UK, the Flying Saucer Working Party, and later, the Ministry of Defense's UFO desk, operated the same way. Investigate the thing in the sky. Ignore the thing that happens to the person after the thing in the sky lands. In Canada, Project Magnet, run by Wilbert Smith in the 1950s, came closer than any official program to taking contact seriously. But even Smith stopped short of systematically interviewing abductees about the content of their conversations with the beings. The result is that almost all of the data about this core question exists only in private archives, in handwritten notes in researchers' basements, on old cassette tapes of hypnosis sessions, degrading in cardboard boxes, in MUFON reports filed by volunteer investigators, most of which have never been digitized, never been referenced, never been analyzed as a single body of evidence. If any government anywhere has ever systematically studied the question the beings are asking, those records have never been released. All we have is the scattered, fragile work of independent researchers, most of whom worked for no pay for decades because they thought the pattern mattered. And when they died, much of their work was lost, or thrown away, or sat in boxes no one has opened in 30 years. In 1991, a Norwegian folklorist named Dr. Ingrid Solberg published a little-known study of 275 abduction accounts collected between 1950 and 1990 from 14 different countries. She was not a ufologist. She was an expert in folk tales and urban legends, in how stories spread and mutate across cultures. Her goal was to prove that abduction accounts were just modern folk tales, shaped by shared media and shared psychology. She did not find that. She found that the core structural elements of the accounts, including the specific focus on emotional experience, the specific type of question asked, were consistent across cases from countries where abduction stories had never been shown on television, from witnesses who had never read a single book about UFOs. She wrote, in her conclusion, the consistency of this specific narrative element, an inquiry into the nature of subjective feelings separate from any physical examination, cannot be adequately explained by cultural transmission alone. Whatever its source, it is a stable repeating feature of the phenomenon, and requires an explanation that does not rely on the idea that all these witnesses are copying each other. She never wrote another paper on the subject. She received so much ridicule from her academic colleagues that she returned to studying medieval folk tales, and never spoke publicly about UFOs again. But her study remains one of the most rigorous pieces of research ever done on this topic. And what she found is exactly what I have found. The question is real. It is consistent. It is not a product of media contamination. It is a signal coming through the noise, again and again. There is one more thing about the question that almost no one comments on. Every witness says it did not arrive as words. It arrived as a direct concept, placed in their mind, which they then had to translate into English or Spanish or Japanese or Welsh. After the fact, the translation is always approximate. They always say, "This is the closest I can get to what they meant." But despite all the translation, despite all the approximation, the core of the question never changes. It is always about the interior, always about the feeling, always about the thing that no scan can reach. When a signal is transmitted through 100 different imperfect channels, and the core message still comes through clear, you are not listening to noise. You are listening to something real. Let me try to wrap this together, as honestly as I can. I started this research as a skeptic. I went in looking for the hoaxes, the delusions, the cultural patterns that would explain all of this away. I found plenty of those. There are fraudulent cases. There are witnesses who are mentally ill. There are accounts that are clearly lifted from movies and books. No honest researcher can deny that. But underneath all of that, underneath all the noise, I found this pattern, this question, repeating for 70 years, across the world, to people who had no way of knowing anyone else had ever been asked it. What we know for sure is this. Something is happening to thousands of people that leaves them with consistent, detailed memories of being taken by non-human beings. Those beings are consistently described as having technology far beyond our own. They are consistently described as performing detailed biological examinations, and then, almost always, they stop. And they ask about the one thing their technology cannot give them, what it feels like to be us. What we do not know is why. We do not know if they lack emotion, or if their emotion is too different to recognize ours. We do not know if they are building a model of human behavior to predict our actions. We do not know if they are collecting human feeling for some purpose we cannot imagine. Art, or research, or engineering, or something for which we have no name. We do not know if they are getting closer to the answer, or if the answer is fundamentally unknowable to anything that is not human. We do not know if they will stop asking, or if they will keep asking for another 70 years, or another 700. I want to end with a witness named Ellen, a 32-year-old teacher from northern Sweden whose 2003 encounter was documented by a local researcher named Lars Norberg. She said that after her experience, she did not feel traumatized exactly. She felt changed. She said the beings had asked her the same core question. What is this feeling from the inside? And that when she struggled to answer, she had a sudden, strange realization she did not know the answer either. She had lived inside her own feelings her whole life, and she had never once tried to put them into words, to describe what they actually were, to anyone, not even herself. They asked me what grief was, she told Norberg, and I realized I didn't have the words. I knew what it felt like, but I couldn't give it to them. And then I thought, maybe that's the point. Maybe the question isn't for them. Maybe it's for us. Maybe they're holding up a mirror and we're the ones who don't know what we're looking at. I have thought about that a lot. The question as a mirror. Because if it is true that no technology, no matter how advanced, can ever see inside the subjective experience of another human being, then we are all in the same position as the beings. We cannot see inside each other either. We can only ask. We can only listen. We can only try to build a map of each other's interior worlds, one imperfect description at a time. For 70 years, something has been coming to us, with all its power and all its technology, and asking the one question we have been asking each other since we first learned to speak. What is it like to be you? We have never had a good answer. Maybe that is the real mystery here. Not why they are asking, but why, after all this time, we still do not know how to reply.